Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to look at some more watercolor techniques. First, just as a quick recap from what we started yesterday, is using markers as a watercolor tool. So, just like you did yesterday, you just kind of work on an outline. And remember that this is a good technique for when you're doing rougher textures, like we did yesterday with the bricks and the concrete pavements. You can also use this really well with trees, as some of you discovered yesterday. And just keeping in mind the shapes of things. A lot of times trees, the leaves are a little bit darker on the underside. And for these smaller details, using that long rounded brush. And working the water into the marker and dragging it downwards into the center, and you get some nice textures there. So that's just a quick recap of what we did yesterday, and you can always go back and add, after it dries, you can go through and add some shading and things. But a lot of times, it's, let it dry and then you can come back and work into it. And if you'll notice some cool things that are happening here, just kind of accidentally, some of the brown is seeping into some of the green, and you can get some pretty interesting special effects without even intending it. So that's the recap of markers. Now, a couple of new things we're doing today. First off was we're combining our markers with watercolor palettes. Now, these cakes of watercolor are dry, so a lot of times you have to wet them with some clean, clear water to get them to work for you for paint. And what we're going to do first is something called wet on wet technique for the sky. So what you're going to do for your sky is to get a larger paintbrush. I like to use the squared off paintbrushes for larger areas. Wet your brush with some clean water, and then just wipe that water on the paper. Now you'll notice that my tree is still wet, so I'm not going to go near my tree just yet, because you don't want to do water against water with different colors, because then they're all going to bleed together and you'll lose your shapes. So while you're waiting for one area to dry, you can go work in another section. So I'm not going to go all the way down to my tree. I'm going to stop before I get there, so that way my blue of my sky does not get stuck in my tree. Now I'm wetting my blue palette, and where that water is, I'm just doing a thin line. Here we go, across the top of my page. And just atmospherically, you'll usually notice that as the sky gets closer to the ground, it tends to lighten up a little bit, so you can just pull that downwards. If you're planning on doing clouds, watercolor as a white paint doesn't really work. So what you would do is leave a space in your picture empty that you can go back and work into a cloud later. So I'm just going to leave this cloud shape right here. But I'm just painting wet watercolor on top of a wet surface, and it naturally just kind of spreads and thins out, and you can keep going and thinning out that color as you go. And that is with the blue watercolor palette. So that's the wet on wet technique. It's going to work really well for really big areas, because you can work kind of quickly. So like ground sky, that kind of thing. And then once it dries, you can go back and add in more texture and detail. You do want to give time for your piece to breathe. You don't want to work wet on wet on wet on wet, because eventually your paper is just going to rub straight through, and then you're just going to end up with a big soggy mess in a hole. So one of the hardest things for watercolors is learning how to be patient, paint your area, and then sometimes just kind of pull yourself back from it and just let it breathe for a moment and let it dry before you go back and work back into that area. Okay, so that is wet on wet technique for large areas. Now for your graffiti, one thing that you can do is an ombre effect. And here I'm using pink and orange. while I'm waiting for that stuff to dry. And be really, really careful. I almost put my hand in that wet area, and you don't want to do that because you'll end up smearing all of your hard work. So just be really mindful of that. So right now I'm working on a dry surface. I'm just doing those markers. I'm doing two different complementary colors. And to create an ombre effect, that's when you have two colors that fade into each other. Now when you're doing details, we're back to that round brush. And I'm just dragging the pink downwards. And I'm going to drag that orange upwards into the pink. And as the two colors mingle, they're going to naturally fade into each other. And that creates a pretty nifty graffiti effect. You want to make sure you clean your brush often so that way you don't have accidental mingling. Never want that. And then as it dries and as the colors, just kind of let them do their thing, and they will just naturally bleed into each other. Now another technique, you can also do neat galaxy kind of effects with this, or if you wanted to do something darker. I'm using my watercolor palette now to add some black. And you always want to make, be really careful that you don't use too much water, because then it'll start going into your other areas. So it's always a good idea to kind of tap off the excess on your brush whenever you are adding water to your brush. You can also dab it on a piece of paper towel. And then I'm going to add some blue here to the bottom. Rinse off my brush. I'm going to tap off the excess water, get a little bit more black. And then you can kind of run these two colors together, and they'll naturally fade into each other, create a nice little sort of nebulous effect if that's what you're going for. And then when it dries, then you can go in with some white acrylic paint, which I can provide for you, and add in details like stars. But you have to let it dry really well first. So you have the marker technique. You have ombre effect, one color up here, one color down here, and then add water to drag the two together. You have a neat little galaxy effect here. And for painting large areas like the skies, remembering that watercolor paint does not paint white. So if you want an area to be, for example, clouds, you're going to have to leave that area empty so that you can work into it. You can't put white watercolor down on paper. It just doesn't, it's too thin for that. So hopefully this is helpful. You saw a couple of techniques that you can use, and today we can continue painting. Have fun, guys.